This is Iowa's news leader. This is KCCI 8 News Close Up.
Now on Close Up, Governor Kim Reynolds puts pen to paper. How a new law could impact religious freedom, and the other changing who can sit on Iowa's boards and commissions. And new hope for firefighters who are battling for more medical coverage in the state. The new changes that are once again moving through the State House. But first, we learn we are less than 2 months away from Iowa's primary election. Welcome to Close Up. I'm Chief Political Reporter Amanda Rooker. On June 4th, Iowans will decide which candidates from each party they want to face off in the general election. There are primary races in 3 of Iowa's 4 congressional districts. Republican Marionette Miller Meeks, who spent the past 4 years representing Iowa's 1st congressional district, will be on the primary ballot. She's facing Republican David Pouch. Whoever wins will face Democrat Christina Bohannon in November. And 2 Democrats are facing off for the District 3 seat, Lennon Bockham and Melissa Vine. Both are vying for the opportunity to take on Republican incumbent Zach Nunn. In Iowa's 4th congressional district, incumbent Republican Randy Feenstra is facing GOP challenger Kevin Virgil. And Democrat Ryan Melton will be on the general election ballot for the 4th district. There is no primary race in Iowa's 2nd congressional district. Republican incumbent Ashley Hinson is being challenged by Democrat Sarah Corkery. Well, there are a lot of races to talk about in the upcoming primary election, so we are here with KCCI political analyst Dennis Goldford. Always great to have you explaining all of the things happening in our state, so thanks for joining us.
Heavy load to carry.
Well, first, let's just talk about primary elections in general. You know, what is the importance of them? What type of voters tend to turn out in these elections?
It's in a primary election, at least in the American context, where the people of one party decide who their candidates shall be to face off against the candidate of the other party. So typically, primaries are important because they get to decide, so to speak, who gets on the November menu. Iowa is a closed primary state. That is, unlike some other states where you can just walk into a polling place and say, I'd like the Democratic ballot or I'd like the Republican ballot, as long as you're a registered voter. In Iowa, you have to be a member of the particular political party whose primary you want to participate in. So what happens in primaries normally, and this occurs nationwide, is you get mostly the party faithful showing up, and sometimes ideologically, whether liberal or conservative, the most extreme members of the party. We talk a lot about the right to vote, but Americans don't really believe that. In a general election for president, for example, we get maybe a 60% turnout, something like that, but that means 2 out of every 5 eligible voters aren't showing up. In a congressional midterm election, we get around 40%, somewhat in that area. But in primaries, typically, including the Iowa caucuses, you have normally only about 20% of eligible voters showing up for a primary election. So that means it's important who shows up, even more than how many show up.
What's at stake in this particular primary election? Obviously, in November, it will be an election where you have a president at the top of the ticket. Does that have any impact then when people are trying to pick which candidate they want facing off in the general election?
That can, but generally, if you're talking about congressional districts,
Sure.
Maybe for gubernatorial races it's a little different, but for congressional districts and certainly state-level offices, it's more state-based, state-oriented kinds of issues that have to come into play. Typically, in a primary, if there's an incumbent member of the legislature, Congress, the State House, or whatever, unless there's been some sort of scandal on the part of that incumbent or allegation of scandal, typically there really isn't any kind of significant primary challenger. It's more normal, absent a scandal, that if there's no incumbent, say, and we have Republicans from all 4 congressional districts this time, and it would be typically in a Democratic primary who seems on the part of the party faithful to be the best challenger for that incumbent member of the other party.
Yeah, what's interesting here is of the 4 districts, we have 2 incumbents that are facing, 2 Republicans that are facing primary challengers. What do you make of that?
Well, I don't know the details about who these particular folks are yet, but I know in Republican primaries generally, and particularly if we're talking about the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate, in this age of political polarization, Republicans from safe districts, for example, Iowa 4 is an incredibly Republican district, always has been, even if the district boundaries have changed. Republicans are more afraid of being primaried from the right, so to speak, instead of facing their Democratic challenger. So again, there can be somebody in the party of the incumbent who thinks that the incumbent, absent a scandal or something like that, just isn't faithful enough to particular party positions on issues or issues of concern to that particular person challenging the incumbent.
And especially when we've seen within the House Republican caucus, in Congress, the amount of divisiveness, the amount of turnover. I wonder if that plays a role at all we're seeing more general type, political outsider type people saying, I want to take on the establishment.
The problem if you're a political outsider is at a certain point you become an insider.
Sure.
And there's always somebody on the outside who makes that point and saying, well, you started as a political outsider, but now you've sold out, you're a member of the inside group, and it's time to refresh the office, the seat, so to speak. But no, we live in just a remarkably polarized era. It's something I've been saying for quite some time, in fact. And when you add in the extra sources of information, however valid the information is, in other words, not just good news operations like KCCI, but you talk about social media, the internet generally, talk radio, cable TV. There are all these additional sources of supposed information, again, may or may not be accurate, and people can be listening to those that might encourage certain kinds of challenges in particular races.
What issues do you think may motivate people to get out to the polls? You mentioned it's usually a smaller group of people that are voting in these primaries, but are there any issues that you think are really top of mind for voters right now? Well,
on the Democratic side, the Democrats make the claim that with the Dobbs decision that overturned Roe v. Wade and a constitutional right to abortion, the Democrats argue that the dog finally caught the car it was chasing. In other words, they don't know what to do with it on the Republican side. And you've got the controversy over in vitro fertilization. Some pro-lifers say that shouldn't be allowed. Others would say, of course, it should be allowed. So there's some controversies there on the Republican side that may encourage a person with one leaning over another to focus there. But on the Democratic side, they're hoping that the thought that IVF as well as abortion may be at stake may motivate a lot of potential voters who are eligible but just haven't voted to turn out and vote this time around. So the Democrats are hoping for an increased turnout on that side. Republicans will use various social issues like homosexuality, abortion, birth control, and so forth to try to motivate their more hardline supporters.
Well, Dennis, thank you for breaking down that for us. We still have so much more to talk about with you, so when Close Up returns, we're going to look at new polls showing how Iowans could be leaning ahead of this primary election. Welcome back to Close Up. Last month, the Des Moines Register and Mediacom released an Iowa poll showing whether people in our state in each congressional district want a Republican or a Democrat in that seat. We continue our conversation with KCCI political analyst Dennis Goldford. So Dennis, right now in all 4 districts, Republicans hold those seats. What the poll found is that in 3 of the 4 districts, Iowans still say they want a Republican, but in Iowa's 1st congressional district, Iowans slightly more said that they want a Democrat in that seat. Republican Mariannette Miller Meeks has held that for 2 terms. She's running for a 3rd. What does that tell you?
Well, it tells us, of course, that Democrats are more motivated this time than they've been in the past. But, there's a wonderful old expression, there's many a slip twixt the cup and the lip. In other words, they can say at this point they want a Democrat in that district. Whether that actually occurs in November is another question entirely. Again, we say in real estate, I'm told, that the 3 most important factors are location, location, and location. In electoral politics, the 3 most important factors are turnout, turnout, and turnout. So there may be some folks in Iowa 1 who are somewhat dissatisfied with some votes Representative Miller Meeks has taken, or maybe some comments she'd made. I've not been able to see many of those at this point. But we want to find out what's going to happen actually in November, because that's where the rubber meets the road.
And I know we're talking about the primary election. What I find very interesting in that 1st district is that you have Mariannette Miller Meeks. If she wins this primary election and holds the seat, she would be facing, once again, Democrat Christina Bohannon, who lost, is running for this seat again. Anything you think to watch out for? I know that's far ahead to November, but just the fact that these 2 had somewhat of a feisty campaign the last time around, this could potentially be another messy rematch.
Well, there were no major mistakes, I recall, on either side from last time around. So it's not as though, if that's accurate, it's not as though one can repair whatever damage and start again, or have another try in fixing the problems that were there last time. But again, the last time around, of course, in 2022, it was a midterm election, and that's a somewhat different electorate. It's a smaller electorate from what we have when we have a presidential election. So the presidential race will drive turnout, even though some people show up and vote for president and don't vote for anything down ballot, even members of Congress. But I think that you have to remember that, again, when you have fewer people showing up for a midterm election, it tends to be more the party stalwarts. And the difficulty for the Democrats is that Republicans generally take voting more seriously than Democrats do. And older folks, who tend to be somewhat more Republican here in Iowa at least, older folks take voting more seriously than younger folks do. So structurally, the race will favor even Representative Mariannette Miller Meeks. But this particular challenger's making a shot across the bow, and we'll see if she can do any better than last time. But again, as we know from politics, close counts only in horseshoes and hand grenades.
Dennis, you are familiar in all things in the political world, but most recently we've been talking to you a lot about the Iowa caucuses, the Republican candidates that just swept through here. In past cycles, have you noticed at all after a certain party, in this case, the Republicans were really dominating the news cycle, dominating attention here, now going into, the next election cycle, does that fire up Republicans to come out and vote in other, down races, or will it really have a negligible impact?
Yeah, the difficulty for any party is if your supporters think, oh, we've got this won, so I don't need to take the time and make the effort to show up to vote. So you want to keep your supporters, no matter which party, motivated enough to turn out to vote. We've shortened the hours a little bit, and but still there's plenty of time for people to turn out to vote. But you want to keep people fired up. That again leads to charges, counter charges. People say more emotional things to make sure your people show up. But no, Iowa's become increasingly Republican, as we'll talk about. And the key thing for Republicans is to convince their voters, yes, we need every last one of you. For Democrats, they have to convince their voters, yeah, we've been taking it in a pretty rough way the past couple of cycles. The only way we can take it back is if you show up and vote. So both parties, you're right, equally have to fire up their supporters to show up.
And speaking of that, of Iowa becoming increasingly Republican, obviously right now, if you look at the makeup of Congress, we're entering into a battle of these two parties, both Republicans, wanting to keep majority in the House, Democrats wanting to win that back. Iowa has seen in the past Democrats and Republicans in these House seats, but right now we have all Republicans in them. What do we make of that? Is there potential for an all-Republican congressional delegation to go back, or could something change in this next cycle?
Things can always change, but I think there is good potential. I mean, if I were a political strategist working for either of the two parties at this point, I find myself a little bit more comfortable on the Republican side than the Democratic side, because the Democratic side has more of an uphill battle. But Iowa used to be a purple state. In other words, equal chance, or a pretty equal chance, for members of either party to go to Congress, or else to vote for president or governor. But over the past several years, Iowa's become much more of a red state. We're not red like Alabama or Mississippi, but as you said, we have a completely Republican congressional delegation, 2 senators, 4 members of the House. Iowa voted for the Republican for president the last 2 times. In fact, there was a phenomenon political scientists called Obama-Trump counties, and they were interested. There are about 3,100 counties in the country. And we looked at counties that voted for President Obama in 2012 and flipped. I mean, you would never think they would do it, but they flipped and they voted for Donald Trump in 2016. There were 206 of these counties in the country, so less than 10%. But Iowa had more of these Obama-Trump counties than any other state in the union. Iowa had 31 of our 99 counties that voted for President Obama in 2012 and flipped and voted for Donald Trump in 2016. And that marks really the movement of Iowa into a much more of a red state, say, than a purple state.
Quickly, I want to talk about Iowa's 3rd congressional district, because we are seeing a Democratic primary there to take on freshman incumbent Zach Nunn. Lennon Bockham and Melissa Vine are the 2 Democrats running there. I'm just wondering, because Democrats are looking for some House races to try to flip, to try to win back that majority, is there any type of Democrat or type of issues that you think would be important to take on someone like Zach Nunn?
Well, first of all, in interest of full disclosure, let me note that Zach Nunn's a former student of mine.
Sure.
Now, that doesn't affect how I cover him, but that should be on the table. But that being said, the 3rd district, and over time the boundaries have changed. Long ago, I think we were the 4th district, something like that, when we had 5 or 6. It's always been, generally speaking, the most Democratic district in the state. But even here, the Republicans have a bit of a lead over Democrats in voter registration. And so, but there's still significant numbers of Democrats here in the 3rd district, and they're hoping to go after Zach Nunn. And there have been some ads running complaining about some particular stance he's taking on a particular issue. I'm not quite sure who the group is doing that. It doesn't seem to be a party-affiliated group. But at this point, usually if you've got somebody who's in his or her 1st or even 2nd term in Congress, if you can't stop that person after that point, usually absent scandal, that person can look forward to a pretty good career in the House.
Well, Dennis, thank you so much for joining us and looking at all of this. There's still much more to come on Close Up, looking at what's happening at the Iowa State House. We'll look at that when we return. Welcome back to Close Up. Governor Kim Reynolds signed two major bills into law last week. One ended Iowa's requirement to have an equal number of men and women serving on all boards and commissions. The other law now allows Iowans to go to court if they believe the government has infringed on their religion. That law, referred to as the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, requires state and local governments to prove that they have a, quote, compelling interest in order to restrict anyone's religious freedom. 26 other states have signed similar legislation. During a press conference last Wednesday, Governor Kim Reynolds explained why she signed the bill at a private dinner hosted by the Christian conservative group, the Family Leader.
Listen, they've advocated for this bill for a long, long time, and they wanted the freedom to be able to express what was important to them. And so they asked if we would consider signing it there, and we did. Religious liberties have increasingly become under attack. And so this is our opportunity in Iowa to join 26 other states, both led by Republican and Democrats, that have signed this into law. It mirrors federal legislation, and most importantly, it makes sure that government doesn't step in and try to erode really important rights that are guaranteed to individuals with the First Amendment.
But Democrats, along with some business owners and local organizations, say the law has been weaponized in other states to prioritize religious freedom over other civil rights. Connie Ryan with the Interfaith Alliance of Iowa says she's concerned the same could happen in Iowa.
Interfaith Alliance of Iowa believes in religious freedom. We stand strongly in support of religious freedom. We just don't think that religious freedom should be used as justification to take away somebody else's rights. So it can look like an attack on the LGBTQ community. It can be around reproductive rights. It can be around a lot of different things where somebody chooses to not follow the law based on and uses religious freedom as justification for that. And so we think that's wrong, and that everybody should be able to be the state should protect everybody's rights.
Governor Kim Reynolds also signed a law last week repealing the state's gender balance requirement for Iowa's boards and commissions. Now, this goes back to a state law that was passed in the 1980s that made Iowa the first state in the country to require an equal number of men and women on all state boards and commissions. The goal was to increase the number of women serving in those positions. In 2009, state lawmakers voted to extend that requirement to local bodies as well. But Reynolds officially repealed that requirement last Wednesday. Critics of the new law say there continues to be less women serving in politics and government, and that the gender balance requirement is helping to bridge the gap. But without the requirement, they say women will have less representation in state and local government. However, supporters of the law, including Governor Reynolds, say it makes sure that boards and commissions recruit the best qualified candidates instead of focusing on meeting a quota.
Our focus should always be on appointing the most qualified people, and that includes engaged citizens with a genuine interest in serving their state or local government, as well as individuals with valuable experience that directly relates to that position.
The fact that the governor signed a bill eliminating the gender balance requirement on our boards and commissions will mean that fewer women will have a voice in state government and in the way our government works. Why can't we work a little harder to bring balance to these boards and commissions? And why is this a priority of the governor?
The governor also proposed a bill that would eliminate or consolidate more than 100 boards and commissions that the governor says are redundant or unnecessary. She says that bill would increase efficiency to better meet the needs of Iowans. That bill is still alive in the state Senate, but it hasn't passed a full vote there, and it would need to be taken up and approved in both the House and Senate this session in order to still become law this year. Still to come on Close Up, renewed hope for firefighters pushing for expanded medical coverage. The new changes to a bill that is once again moving through the State House. Welcome back to Close Up. There are many things moving through the State House as we get closer to when session is scheduled to end. That includes renewed hope for firefighters who are fighting for expanded medical coverage in our state, a bill requiring the state to cover more types of cancer that firefighters may have gotten from time on the job passed through the House last week. House File 2680 passed unanimously. This is the 5th time the issue has been debated at the State House. The bill had also unanimously passed through the House last month, but it did not advance in the Senate, so House lawmakers brought it back in a larger bill that also includes retirement benefits for law enforcement.
We're going to be fixing something with the Iowa Code in regard to taxes so that it doesn't unfairly tax widows and children of firefighters and police officers that pass away.
KCCI did reach out to the spokesperson for Senate Republicans last week. At the time, they said they had not received the bill. They do expect it to get it this upcoming week. And a bill that would expand postpartum coverage heads to Governor Kim Reynolds' desk. The governor had proposed this bill earlier this year. It expands postpartum coverage for people on Medicaid from 60 days to 1 full year. It would also restrict which pregnant women and infants are eligible for Medicaid coverage based on the family's income. Well, thanks for joining us for KCCI 8 News Close Up. We'll see you back here next Sunday. Have a great day.